Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful for that fantastic reception. Happens every time I walk into a lecture theatre. Tonight's speaker in the latest of our In Conversation series is Jacob Rees Mogg. He's been the MP for North East Somerset since 2010. He's a member of the Exiting the EU Committee of the House of Commons and head of the European Research Group. He is also, and I suspect this is at least in part why you're here, currently the bookies' favourite to be the next Conservative leader. And actually, according to the Conservative Home Survey, which was out today, you're also the members' current favourite to be leader. And that piece says, by the way, that they initially didn't used to put you on the surveys, but they had to add your name because people kept writing your name in, so they've ended up having to put your name on the poll that they run.
Well, my mother's very technologically sophisticated, she's busy.
Now, the format of this event is the same as all the other ones that we've run. We will chat for sort of 30 to 40 minutes. You will grow increasingly frustrated at my inability to ask a pointed question, and that I resemble Jimmy Young, some of you will remember far more than Jeremy Paxman. After that point, we will throw it open to you, and you can ask the pointed, laser-sharp question that you've been preparing for the last 30 or 40 minutes. So let me start, first by pouring you a drink, and secondly, without giving away any secrets, and about other people we've invited to this series to speak. You're the only one we've had to employ an overflow lecture theatre for, and you're the only one where the event sold out within a couple of hours. What is it about someone who's been an MP for 7 years and never held ministerial office, or even been on his own party's front bench, that draws a crowd like that?
Well, I put it entirely down to your organisation and the fact that people want to come and hear you. And that as the series has grown, more people want to come along. It's very hard to see oneself as others see one. However hard one tries, and it's one of the great aims that one should have in life, to try and understand what do other people see positively and negatively about one's own attributes, which is quite difficult to analyse. And so the honest answer is I don't really know why people want to come. I can only guess. And my guess would be the hope that I might say something slightly controversial, but perhaps most importantly, that I'll say what I think. And therefore, if you ask me a question, with a bit of luck, I'll answer it without particularly thinking whether spin doctors would think that was a good answer or not. And I have a feeling that there is a desire in politics for less controlled answers, more straightforward answers, that people can then engage with and argue back about. I mean, I'm very flattered that there are protesters outside. That's great, because they want to engage in political debate. And that's really important, because I think my arguments are good arguments, and if I can engage in debate, I might be able to persuade people that conservatism is worth supporting.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can hold you to that answering questions as we proceed through for the next hour and a bit. Let's talk about the protest outside, because you are simultaneously maybe the most popular speaker we've invited to come along in the series since we've been running it for a year and a bit. But you're also the only one that's attracted a protest. So if I read to you the leaflet that was circulated from the Socialist Worker Student Society, you are apparently on the most reactionary wing of the Tory party. You're against abortion even in case of rape. You're a staunch opponent of gay marriage. You're against the rights of EU nationals to stay. You voted against laws to promote equality and human rights, and you're a warmonger who voted against investigations into the Iraq war. It goes on. To be fair, it goes on quite a lot. I'll paraphrase. But this is our campus, it says, and we shouldn't be inviting politicians who are against the welfare and freedom of our diverse student and staff body. You're not welcome at Queen Mary as a pro-LGBT, pro-choice and anti-racist campus. And then there's a picture of you in a top hat. Do you recognise, when you say that you sometimes struggle to see people as others see you, do you recognise yourself in that description?
Well, I'm sorry I didn't wear a top hat. I didn't realise it was compulsory. Had I done so, I'd obviously brought one along. Some things they say are simply wrong. that when you come to EU citizens, I said during the referendum campaign that I thought we should say, regardless of whether, or what point we left, that anyone who was here legally should be welcome. And I actually think this is really important because, to my mind, people who have left their home and left their family, moved hundreds of miles to a country where they don't speak the language, to work hard and contribute to our society, and did so lawfully under laws we had passed, should be admired and respected, not treated as if they're not welcome. So European member state citizens who have come to the UK, we should admire and value and protect all their rights. So on that, it's simply wrong. On the inquiry into the Iraq War, there was one vote in Parliament when I was there, whilst the Chilcot inquiry was already going on. It's on theyworkforyou.com, and there were lots of votes when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were in charge, which Labour routinely voted against. I was all in favour of an inquiry into the Iraq War. I'm not a warmonger. I've had grave doubts about what the government decided to do in Libya and in Syria. And so I think it's just, some of it's just mere abuse. But do I believe in the sanctity of life? Do I believe that life begins at the point of conception? Yes, very strongly. I do believe that. I think that is when a person is created. And that if you believe life begins at that point, then can you really say it's reasonable to take it? I don't believe in capital punishment either, for exactly the same reason. I don't think it's right for the state to take life.
Of all the things I wanted to talk to you about, the one that I was absolutely determined I was not going to raise, because it seemed to me it had been covered remorselessly in almost any interview I'd read with you over the last couple of years, was the nappy thing. But almost everybody I've said, I'm doing this interview, Jacob, they've said, oh, what about the nappy? So it has clearly struck a chord with people. And as I understand it, your position is that despite having 6 children, you've never changed a nappy. And that's because, in your view, that's the nanny's job. And the nanny would be disgruntled with you were you to attempt to change a nappy because that's her job and you wouldn't do it very well. Is that a fair summary?
It's slightly more nuanced than that. You must bear in mind, the nanny we're talking about is my nanny, who's worked for my family for 52 years and still pretty much thinks of me as one of the children she's looking after. So nanny's views of these things are quite firmly held. You'd be amazed by how many men I've spoken to have either said to me, they've never changed any nappies either, or lucky me. I do recognise that I'm in a fortunate position, but it's absolutely true. Nanny would not think it was a good idea for me to be changing nappies. She thinks it's her job, and people do take a pride in their job, and I think it's important not to interfere in other people's roles.
But does that mean your wife hasn't changed a nappy either?
Oh, no, my wife's definitely changed lots of nappies.
You'll see where I'm going with this. Why is it okay for your wife? I mean, I understand the argument that says we employ the nanny changes the nappy. But why is it okay for your wife to do it, but not for you to do it?
I'm not sure Nanny's too delighted that anybody other than Nanny changes nappies, but it's simply the practicalities of life. But bear in mind, I'm not in a great deal of the time. I'm coming and doing things like this. It's not as if I'm at home 24 hours a day, whereas my wife is a stay-at-home mother.
You also said in one of these discussions about the nappy, you said, I've made no pretense to be a modern man at all, ever. A sentiment I understand, but objectively you are a modern man, aren't you? I mean, we are actually almost identical ages. I'm a month older than you. And I have to say, I'm loving this because most of my life I feel very crusty and old, and I'm now in the role of a sort of metrosexual hipster, but you know, we are modern men, aren't we? You can't pretend to be a throwback to the 18th century.
We are of the age that we are in, and I will confess my cover was pretty much blown yesterday when I was at the DEXU Select Committee. And I looked down at my suit and saw that it was absolutely covered in my 2-year-old's breakfast, that I had made the mistake of picking him out of his high chair, and really, I don't know how Nanny allowed me to do this. I got permission, but nonetheless. And all his breakfast had appeared on my suit. So inevitably we are of the era that we are and can't live in a different era. I think what I'm really trying to get across by saying I don't pretend to be a modern man is I don't pretend to be anything other than what I am or who I am. That there isn't a facade that I'm putting forward, and that if we were sitting at home and having this discussion, my answers would be exactly the same. It's not something that I bring out for when I come to Queen Mary's College.
Maybe a few questions about Brexit, not least because you were in the news today on this subject. At Questions today, you made the claim when asking the ministers that Charles Grant of the Centre for European Research had said that officials in the Treasury, these are your words, have deliberately developed a model to show that all options other than staying in the customs union are bad, and that officials tend to use the model to influence policy. Now, Charles Grant of the Centre for European Research has flatly denied he made any such allegation, and the audio of the meeting at which he's supposed to have said this has now been released, and he clearly doesn't make that allegation. So do you withdraw the allegation that officials at the Treasury are deliberately developing a model to show that options other than the customs union are bad?
Well, it's quite interesting because he put out a tweet a few months before this meeting, basically saying exactly the point I raised with the minister, and I have retweeted that if people want to have a look at it. It was picked up by Guido Fawkes, that he had said that the Treasury was trying to soften the Brexit policy. And so I had heard this rumour, and therefore I asked the minister, because it was at a meeting the minister was at. The minister's memory of the meeting was that this had been said. I wasn't there, so I don't know, and I never pretended to know, but it's very much in line with what Charles Grant tweeted in July. So it is a worrying suspicion, and I think on this whole issue, the thing I'm really concerned about is that you get, a week ago, the CBI coming out saying it's really important we stay in the customs union. You get the Chancellor in Davos saying the CBI is absolutely brilliant, or the EU-funded CBI, as we ought to call it, is a wonderful organisation and we should have as modest a Brexit as possible and remain closely aligned. And then a few days after that, you have a leak of a Treasury-designed economic model that says the only thing to do is stay in the customs union. You just wonder whether there isn't a pattern in that, whether there isn't some orchestration rather than being an accidental constellation of the stars.
But there may be some orchestration in those elements, and it may even be that Charles Grant's claim, which he made in the tweet you referred to, which is that the Treasury wanted us to stay in the customs union and was putting pressure, officials were putting pressure on. That's one thing. Your claim was slightly different, which was that they had deliberately developed a model in order to produce results that would end up arguing that case. Now, that's a much more specific claim, and that's the claim that Charles Grant says he didn't make.
Okay, if he says he didn't make it, he says he didn't make it, but he made a very similar claim on Twitter. But if you look at the facts of what the Treasury is doing, they have produced something that models various scenarios for our trade that assumes we would apply the common external tariff to our trading partners once we've left the customs union. Well, this is absolutely bonkers. No government in its right mind would put tariffs on, higher tariffs than there already are, on food, clothing and footwear. It would simply make the standard of living of people in this country worse, for no benefit to this country. Why would any government do that? So the underlying assumptions of what the Treasury is producing its forecast based upon are designed to produce a bad outcome from the forecasts. It's exactly what they did prior to the referendum, so it is of a piece. So what Charles Grant said or didn't say at a lunch doesn't really matter very much, and I never claimed to have heard it.
No.
What does matter is that he broadly indicated this in a tweet. It fits in with the facts, and it's why you can be so suspicious of these forecasts, because they are designed to a particular end, and the end is to show the only thing we should do, lo and behold, is stay in the customs union, which basically means not leaving the European Union.
Okay, so it is your belief that, even if Charles Grant didn't say this, it is your belief that civil servants are deliberately producing evidence in order to skew the outcome of these discussions?
Well, I think the blame always has to lie with ministers, actually. And we knew very clearly before the Brexit vote that the Treasury was being guided very strongly by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I think it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer who has to take responsibility for his department.
Okay. About a week ago, you had, well, I thought it was a very interesting exchange with David Davis at the Select Committee hearing, where you were pushing him on why the government didn't simply extend Article 50. If not all of the negotiations can be achieved in time, rather than going into some sort of transitional or implementation stage, the government should simply push back Article 50. Now, he had an argument for why he didn't want to do that, but what I wasn't entirely clear about from the meeting was whether you were advocating your view or whether you were just trying to tease out the government's position. Is it your view that given where we currently are, the government should be extending Article 50?
No, I was merely posing the question. And fortunately, since that exchange, the government's position has to some extent been clarified, so that the Prime Minister is now saying we will leave the requirement for free movement of people. And that's a very important part of having left the European Union, and therefore people who come after the date we've left will not have the same rights as those before, and that they are looking at a system, and the Prime Minister said this a couple of days ago, where we will not automatically accept new laws from the European Union. So if we're not accepting new laws, if we're out of the free movement of people, then the 30th of March is different from the 29th of March 2019. I was just posing the question, if this wasn't happening, which is what it seemed like when David Davis came before the committee, then were they not going to look at the argument about simply extending it? But it was never my preferred option. My preferred option has always been that we should leave on the 29th of March, and it should be an implementation period, implementing the decision to leave, rather than a transition period where you're transitioning from being a member to not being a member.
Before the last election, you called for a pact between the Conservative Party and UKIP. Now,
before the last election,
before
but one.
The last, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, UKIP have imploded somewhat since then, but there's still a sizable UKIP vote out there, and still UKIP members. What would your message be today to UKIP members or UKIP voters after the last couple of weeks that they and their leader have had?
Dear me. I'm not sure I want to dwell on private grief, but I would advise UKIP voters to join the Conservative Party and vote for the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party is heading towards delivering Brexit. It may not provide everything in the transition period, but as long as the end state is clear that we are really leaving the European Union, that means the single market and the customs union as well, then actually the Conservative Party is doing the main thing that UKIP exists for. What I think is really interesting is that UKIP was so dependent on the charisma of Nigel Farage, and that without him as leader, UKIP has never been able to recapture the momentum he created.
Also today in the Commons, as well as the question that you took part in, there was a debate about introducing a form of maternity and paternity leave for MPs, which at the moment doesn't exist. Now, the details of this are still to be resolved, and today's vote was only indicative. But are you sympathetic to the general issue, the idea that we need some form of maternity leave for parliamentarians?
Yes, I'm extremely sympathetic to the idea of maternity leave. And as long as it's voluntary, I have no objection to paternity leave. Why I say as long as it's voluntary, I'd have been off for 2 years after the last 7 if it had been compulsory and you'd had 6 months every time. If it had been a year every time, I'd been off for 4 years out of 7, and I wouldn't have been much of an MP. And I don't think you should set it in such a way as that MPs feel that they've either got to be an MP or to have children. But you really want to make the House of Commons a place where women feel welcome and fully able to do the job of an MP. And therefore, all the support that is suggested to provide an extra researcher, somebody who can do the administrative work of an MP, I completely support. The thing I have my doubt about is proxy voting, because I think as soon as you allow an MP to appoint a proxy, why not then for an MP whose ill and can't come into the House of Commons for that reason? What about a Prime Minister who's in China and can't come in? And once you have a proxy for one reason, then doesn't it make it sensible to have it for a lot of other reasons? But actually, that vote of an MP is a very personal thing that can't be divided from the individual MP.
How do we get around this then? Because I mean, I might share some of these concerns. I mean, it seems to me we don't want to go down the route of the New Zealand Parliament, where the whips cast votes on behalf of parliamentarians. But there is a problem at the moment with particularly women who have maternity leave. They don't vote, their voting record drops, then they get pilloried in the newspaper for being the laziest MP in existence or whatever. And I'm not sure how we get round that issue if we don't allow some form of proxy voting.
Well, I think we need to... Theyworkforyou.com is a very useful website. It's a very interesting website, but it's not perfect in what it reports. But it would be very easy for it to give a 100% attendance record to women who were on a maternity leave. And it would just have a footnote, or it would say, and that's not a difficult thing to do. It doesn't need legislation to do it. They could do it voluntarily. They could say any MP who notifies us that they are on maternity or paternity leave will be deemed to maintain their average voting record. It seems to me to be perfectly fair. And the truth is that most votes in the House of Commons, whether any individual MP turns up or not, doesn't actually matter. That the government will get its business, there's a pairing system. I've been on the DEXU committee, and for the first few months I was on it, one Conservative MP was off on maternity leave, and one Labour MP was off on maternity leave. It therefore balanced out, and this is often true out of the 650 MPs, that the government won't be dependent on women on maternity leave turning up to vote. There may be the really exceptional cases, and these are the occasions when the whips have people brought in by ambulance. You know, people who are dying. You know particularly all the stuff around 1979 and what happened then, and to make sure that the government could keep going. Under those circumstances, if people who are on their deathbed are coming in on a very exceptional basis, I don't think it's that unreasonable for women who've had babies to come in on the same basis.
What about the more general idea that the composition of the House of Commons matters? I mean, are you sympathetic to the idea that we have a problem in terms of the type of people who are becoming MPs? And that, bluntly, there are too many people like me and you in the House of Commons, and the place would be better if it was more diverse.
I think the work of Baroness Jenkin and Women to Win has been tremendously important, because what it's done for the Conservative Party is persuade women of the highest calibre that what they want to do is be members of Parliament. And that's brought really, really first-class people in. And I think that's so much more important than saying we must have a quota. I think what you want to do is persuade people that their ambition is to become a member of Parliament, and you want to do that from as wide a variety of backgrounds as possible. I'll whisper this quietly, but you don't want everybody in the House of Commons to be like me. It'd be frightfully boring if they were all like me, and if everyone was like me, I wouldn't have got a crowd to turn up, would I? Because you'd all be the same as every other MP. You need variety, you need diversity, but you should do that because that's what people want to do, and because the parties persuade good people from different backgrounds to throw their hat into the ring, not because you legislate or the parties insist on quotas or particular shortlists.
And if you had to come up with a couple of characteristics that you're particularly concerned about, what groups are you worried about in particular that are absent, either completely or disproportionately from the House of Commons at the moment?
The people who are probably the least represented are the poorest in society. And I think that you want to get people who have... most people in the House of Commons are, and once you get there, of course, you're paid, but most people have a relatively comfortable history. And I think we need to be able, and as I understand you've done here, get people who've come from very deprived backgrounds to come to the House of Commons to bring their experience in. And that's probably the thing that is most absent.
What about, I mean, recently, without going into individual details, but there's been quite a few cases of people whose pasts have been raked over and various things they've done in the past have come up and caused them problems. To what extent does it matter what a politician did in their past? Or should we be more forgiving than we currently are about previous misdemeanours?
Well, it's got to be contextualised and balanced. That if King Herod applied for membership of the House of Commons, you might think it wasn't altogether a good idea. If, on the other hand, somebody aged 20 kissed somebody under the mistletoe, it's not the end of the world. And I think people of my age who are relatively new to social media need to understand that people of a younger generation have put everything onto social media. And do we really want to elect people who at the age of 12 decided that they wanted to be politicians and therefore have never put anything of any kind on social media that could come back to bite them? I mean, it'd be a pretty boring lot, wouldn't it, if that's what you had? And so I think we need to have some proportionality, really. And that's in the eye of the voter. Does the voter mind? And sometimes I think the voter is much more relaxed about these things than fellow politicians who are endlessly in the search of a gaffe.
Let's talk a little bit about the Conservative Party and its current state. Last November you met with Steve Bannon. Now, leaving aside Trump, who strikes me as a unique phenomenon, what lessons do you think the Conservative Party could learn from the broader political strategy that Bannon and the people around him espoused?
It's very interesting, the Trump phenomenon, as you say. How has he been so successful? One of his successes is his ability to use social media, his direct connection with tens of millions of Americans, giving his views, avoiding the traditional media. And the second thing, and this is one of the things that I learned from meeting Steve Bannon, is his determination to deliver on some of the high-profile promises that he made, and to make sure that they happened, and that they happened in the first year, and that therefore he was keeping the people who put him in on side. So what do we learn from that? As Conservatives, we should be good at using social media, and better than we are, but that also if we make promises in our manifesto that appeal to our voters, it's really, really important that we deliver on them, because people take those promises seriously and will hold politicians to account on it.
Labour Party currently has somewhere over 500,000 members. The Liberal Democrat membership is currently the highest it's ever been. Green Party membership is not quite as high as it was a couple of years ago, but still a damn sight higher than it was 4 or 5 years ago. SNP membership as a proportion of the Scottish population is the highest of any political party in Europe. The Conservative Party is now down, we think, to about 100,000, maybe slightly more than 100,000 people. And this strikes me as an inherent problem for the party, and there's lots of evidence at the last election that getting people out there knocking on doors matters. What can you do to reverse that trend in Conservative membership?
Look to history, because the Conservative Party was the first mass political movement. The Primrose League is incredibly successful at the end of the 19th century. It gets up, I think, over 1 million members by 1910. And then the Woolton reforms get the Conservative Party to over 2 million members. So how did they do it? Well, they did it on a grassroots basis. What's interesting about the Labour Party, actually, is that it's been a grassroots movement. It's come up from the country, not been directed from the Labour Party headquarters, and that's where momentum's come from. And what have they done? They've harnessed social media. Jeremy Corbyn has, I don't know, 1.5 million followers on Twitter. The Prime Minister has 400,000. So they've been more successful at doing that. They were more imaginative about social media in the last general election, and I think that's how you connect more broadly with society rather than with the Conservatives' relatively ageing membership. What else do you do? You get out and talk to people. That I think one of the things we haven't been doing, that we were discussing before we came in, Sam Gyimah came here, and that's really important that politicians should be out and about meeting voters. In the general election, it was very controlled, that the Prime Minister was kept in a bubble to keep her away from voters, and whoever advised on that was making a mistake because it made the politicians remote. But you have to get oomph to the local party so that people feel there's something on the ground worth doing. Why they want to get out in the rain and deliver a leaflet, but it needs to be more than that. You need some invigoration, some excitement, some feeling that being a Tory member can change the world, that you contribute to policy rather than just being expected to tramp the streets. And so I think we need to create an excitement about it, an energy about it, and we need to talk to people more.
And one of the few powers that Conservative grassroots members still have are exercised in leadership elections. So, although not at this stage, but the first stage of any leadership election in the Conservative Party at the moment would be a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister triggered by letters sent by MPs to Graham Brady, the chair of the 22. Have you signed a letter to Graham Brady calling for a vote?
No, I haven't.
Are there any conditions under which you would do that?
Not as long as Mrs May is the Prime Minister, no. I would not sign a letter calling for her to go. I think the Conservative Party gets itself into an awful muddle with leadership elections, that they create an enormous amount of bitterness and very rarely leave you better off than you were before. I think it took the Tory Party 20 years to recover from the decapitation of Margaret Thatcher. And I think that...
You could argue that it still hasn't.
You could argue that. It's not an unreasonable argument, actually. And 20 years was a relatively arbitrary cut-off. And so I think that Mrs May has set out clearly what she's aiming to achieve with Brexit in her Lancaster House speech, Tory Party manifesto, slightly watered down by Florence, but not impossibly so, something that people like me could live with. And it's worth supporting her to do that and recognising some of the difficulties that would be faced by any leader with a very small majority. That it's all very well saying there should be the smack of firm government, but if the smack of firm government comes up with a parliamentary defeat, it doesn't look strong, it looks weak. And the Prime Minister every day and the Chief Whip have to balance whether they can get something through the House of Commons. And if they can't, they're better off not proposing it.
So in the event that there is a vote of no confidence, you would support the Prime Minister in that
I'm
vote?
supporting the Prime Minister, yes.
In the event that she did not either stood down or was defeated in such a vote and there was a vacancy, to return to what we were discussing right at the beginning when the Conservative Home website discovered that you were currently the party member's favourite. Your line on this, as I understand it, is there is no vacancy. But you could follow General Sherman, who famously said, if drafted, I will not run. If nominated, I will not accept. And if elected, I will not serve. I mean, you could rule out the possibility that under any circumstances would you run for the Conservative leadership.
I think, once again, one can look at history. No leader...
Well, General Sherman is a historical figure.
Indeed. And tanks have been named after him. But I'm a backbench member of Parliament, and in government, no backbencher has ever gone on to be leader of the Conservative Party. It has happened in opposition. But in government, the Conservative Party, since Stanley Baldwin, has always gone for somebody who has been Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, or Home Secretary. And the reason for that is that it used to be chosen, as you know, by the Magic Circle, but is now chosen by parliamentary colleagues, and they always go for a senior cabinet minister. So I think it's better, rather than dealing with what I might say or not, to deal with the practicalities. And the practicalities of the backbench MP, it is very hard to see how I could be a candidate of any seriousness.
No, it's not. It's very easy to see how you could become a candidate. Because the rules now are different to the rules in 1963 or 1955, and so it would be very possible for you to become a candidate. You would merely have to be in the last two of the parliamentary party and then go out to the grassroots, and where you are currently the favourite.
So it's very flattering to be the favourite of the grassroots. I'm genuinely that I greatly appreciate the confidence that people are showing in me, and I hope I can use that to advance the political ideas that I believe in. But you have to be voted through by members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, to get to that last two, who expect to be voting for a minister. And that's where history's always been.
So, okay, so in which case, were you not to be a minister, and then obviously in a few years' time you may be a minister, but were you not to be a minister, you wouldn't stand, because there would be no point in you standing?
I can see no circumstances where a non-minister would be likely to be a serious candidate.
Okay. Well, final couple of questions, and then we will throw it open to the audience. You did an interview the other day in which said you'd never been to IKEA.
And how many of you thought I was regularly in IKEA, if you thought about this at all? I'm not Mr. Flatpack.
McDonald's. Have you ever been to a McDonald's?
I have. I actually quite like McDonald's.
Weatherspoons. Have you ever been in a Weatherspoons?
I've been to a Weatherspoons, yes. So it's a great Eurosceptic chain, so all go and drink your beer in Weatherspoons.
Nando's.
Never been to Nando's, no.
Greg's.
Yes. Now, if you want to get the best cream buns, go to the Greg's in the High Street in Keynsham. It's actually, if you all know all my secrets, this is my Friday treat when I've got a day in the constituency. I go into Greg's and buy for my agent and for myself cream buns. I usually have a chocolate eclair or one of those very gooey shoe buns. Anyway, they're jolly good.
And the last of these, Lidl.
I've never been into Lidl.
Right, I could have guessed that. And the two questions I always ask to round up, and then we will throw it open to the audience. When you were growing up, who was your political hero? I mean, when I was very little, and this is a dark secret, it was Harold Wilson, but that was because we lived in London in Smith Square, and he was living in Lord North Street, and having the Prime Minister living a few doors away from me was really quite exciting. But then I realised he wanted to take all our money away, and I thought this wasn't a good idea. From then on, my great political hero was unquestionably Margaret Thatcher. The clarity of thought and of purpose, the drive, the energy. She was a most exciting leader. And the last question before we throw it open to the audience, if you had a piece of advice to give to a young, aspiring politician, what would that advice be?
Perseverance. When I was applying for seats, I lost count of the number of seats I applied for. And by the time I was applying to North East Somerset, Conservative Central Office was absolutely desperate to stop me being selected. And that if you want to get on in politics, you can, but you have to keep going. You have to throw your hat into the ring again and again and again until people get bored of throwing your hat back at you. And that would be the advice I would give really strongly to all of you. People I knew at university, cleverer than me, more political than me, all those qualities that would have made them brilliant MPs, but not perseverance. And if you've got perseverance, then you will get through into the House of Commons.
Okay, well, we're going to take questions from the floor. We're going to take questions in groups of two. And because there's an overflow room, in a minute I'm about to check tweeted questions, and I will throw some of those in that may have come from the overflow room. So if I'm looking down at my pad, I'm not ignoring you. Just one thing. Last week, or whenever he was here, 2 weeks ago, Sam Gyimah had the crazy idea that he wanted to hear what you thought. I thought it was a ludicrous idea when he expressed it to me. In order to get through as many questions as possible, let's have one sentence that ends with a question mark, please, in each question, and then we can rattle through as many, and I'm sure Rees Mogg will be brief in replying as well. So, first one is this chap here with the sort of burgundy top and the black hair, and I'll take this woman down here, please. Yes, you, yeah. So, start, please, sir.
Do you want me to stand, or?
No, you can stay seated. Unless...
Okay, so over the last 8 years now, we've seen a massive rise in poverty. A fifth of the UK population now live in poverty, and child poverty has gone up dramatically. Do you agree that this is an absolute disgrace? Do you agree that this has been caused by Conservative Party policies, and what would you do to change the situation?
And we'll get through more if we don't applaud the question. And now the woman, yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Mogg, Rees Mogg. It's Brenda from Bristol. I'd like to ask you what incentives the government are implementing to support SMEs in preparation for Brexit. I note that Enterprise Ireland, they have a scheme offering a €5,000 grant. And I'd like to know whether our government are likely to implement the same scheme.
Okay. On the issue of poverty, it very much depends on what figures you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with relative poverty or absolute poverty. Absolute poverty has continued to decline in this country, and interestingly, inequality is at its lowest level since 1985 in this country. And what the government has done with its welfare reforms, to my mind, has been really important. And as it's rolled out, as the universal credit is rolled out, key, because it will ensure that there is always an incentive to be employed rather than unemployed. It takes away the poverty trap. So, under the universal credit, 63% of benefits will be withdrawn for every pound earned. And that sounds high, and in my view it's too high, and it should be an object of policy to reduce it. But currently it's over 90% that is withdrawn, which means that people who go into work find that they can be worse off than if they remain on benefits. And the best way out of poverty is work, and that's always been the case. So the universal credit is the greatest answer to dealing with the poverty issue, but it's a relative poverty issue in this country, not an absolute poverty issue. In terms of what is the government doing to help SMEs, as far as I'm aware, there are no specific grants in relation to Brexit. What the government ought to be doing, and it's easier for me as a backbencher to say what the government ought to be doing, it should be ensuring that we get the benefits of Brexit, and that is taking some of the regulations off the shoulders of SMEs. It was rumoured before the last budget that the Chancellor wanted to lower the VAT threshold, so that more companies would have had the bureaucracy of dealing with VAT. It's completely the wrong way around. What we want to be doing is raising the VAT thresholds to take the administrative burden off companies. There's this whole proposal for digitisation of tax, so that companies, small companies, have to make quarterly returns. This is absolutely bananas. It will put people off going into business, and it will make small businesses have higher costs because they will simply have to pay their accountants more to make the returns. So what I would like to see us do is stop thinking of silly regulations that will make life of SMEs worse, and then once we've left the European Union, and that relates to the VAT threshold, which we can't put up until we've left the European Union, look at ways of easing regulations on SMEs so they can get on with the business of doing business, which is what they want.
Okay, I'll take the woman in the front row, one of my former students, always welcome back. And the chap in the sort of orangey shirt there. Yes, please.
Mr. Rees Mogg, I just wanted to ask you a quick something about the motion that was passed last night on restoration and renewal. Do you feel like, due to the fact that Parliament voted for a full decant, albeit temporary, do you feel that this could have a severe short-term and long-term effect on our well-evolved parliamentary democracy? Is there a risk that it may never return back to normal? And is Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, massively underestimating the impact this could have on our Parliament and how it functions?
Yeah, please.
Hi. In a hypothetical situation where you become Prime Minister in 10, 15 years' time, would you hold votes to change laws on same-sex marriage and abortion, or do you think they've been decided already and you just leave them as they are?
And on that subject, because I said I'd take some questions from social media from people in the other overflow room, someone has explicitly asked, would you stand under a Conservative leader who was pro-choice, pro-gay marriage and pro-trans rights in order to stop Jeremy Corbyn getting into Downing Street?
Okay, I'll answer all three of those questions. The first question on restoration and renewal. I was on the committee that looked at it, and the reason I voted against the motion yesterday was I think we need to start again on the basis of which we're doing it, because we voted in favour, and I agreed to this, to full decant on the basis that a temporary chamber could be put up in Richmond House, in the courtyard outside Richmond House, which would have been relatively cheap. It turned out that the people who had given us thousands of pages of report, these really expensive consultants, got their measurements wrong by 16 feet and 4 inches. And therefore they've got to knock down the whole of Richmond House and rebuild it, other than the facade which is listed. So it's even more expensive than just knocking the whole thing down. I then discovered today that the same approach had been done with the Elizabeth Tower. In the Elizabeth Tower, the price has doubled from 30 million to 60 million, and they were going to put a lift in it, but they've now discovered that the tower would have to be widened to do that because the height is so high that the coil that you need to wind the wires around that pull the lift up. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so forgive me if this is the ABC of engineering approach. They'd have to widen the tower to fit it in, which they can't do. So we get cost estimates that are completely wrong. We get facts, simple facts. It is not difficult to measure the side of a courtyard. And then we decide to spend £4 billion on the basis of wrong facts. And I think that's a great mistake and the wrong way to treat public money. To the heart of your question, there's a wonderful line of Winston Churchill's, which I paraphrase. He said, "We make our buildings and then our buildings make us." Part of our constitutional system is the chance that we started the House of Commons in St Stephen's Chapel and therefore were opposite each other. And that is why the debates are as they are. That's why we've got a two-party system. That is why we have an adversarial system. If we'd remained in the chapter house in Westminster Abbey, which is in a circle, our political life would be very difficult. So yes, there is a worry that if we move out and we move to some strange auditorium, we may find that we never move back and it has political consequences. On the two questions on some of the broader moral issues, the country has made up its mind on these issues. I have my views as a practicing Catholic, and my strongest view is on the issue of life, and that the point that life begins at conception and ends at natural death. I'm also opposed to capital punishment, as I said earlier, but also to euthanasia. I don't think it is right for the state to take life. And I think there are very practical reasons on the euthanasia issue as well. But the law is the settled opinion of the country. I may wish it were not so, but I'm not going to change that. I have no ability to change that. Would I serve under a Prime Minister who took a different view from me? Yes, of course I would. That Theresa May does not hold these views. I don't actually know in detail what her views are, but I am happy to support the leader of the Conservative Party because all these votes are free votes. They are conscience votes. And the conscience of the country is not in the same place as my conscience. But I believe in freedom of conscience and I believe in democracy, and that therefore, if that is the state of play, that is something I accept. And it is for the country at large to decide these issues, and that's where they've been decided. So no, I'm not seeking to impose my conscience on the rest of society.
I understand that answer, but were you in the hypothetical situation that the questioner asked to be Prime Minister, whilst you couldn't impose because other people have views as well, you would not exactly be in a weak position, and you could at least guide and nudge to reopen some of these questions. And presumably, since these matters are so important to you, it would be an abdication of responsibility were you not to try to reopen debate on some of these questions.
I think you've got to be realistic about what you can do in politics. Margaret Thatcher was a strong believer in capital punishment, and she tried, as Prime Minister, to nudge people back in favour of capital punishment, and they would not be nudged. And the House of Commons consistently voted against it under her leadership. The Prime Minister's authority over the moral questions is very, very limited, and quite rightly, we don't want to live in Iran. And I don't see myself as being an Ayatollah. And so I have my views. I think they're very important, and I don't back away from them. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that I think my views are wrong, but they are not the law of the land. They are not going to be the law of the land. And it is quite right that other people's conscience should determine equally with mine, but mine as one conscience against many.
Okay, let's take some more from the floor. I knew we'd have hands flying up. We'll take the woman about 4 rows down. Yeah, with the burgundy top, please. And I'll take this chap here. Right, yeah, there. Yes, please. No, don't look around. Yep, you. Yeah. So, please.
Hi, I'd like to ask you about where you stand on the indefinite detention of asylum seekers, hundreds of which are kept in detention centres, 13 of them, they're survivors of rape, of FGM, of human trafficking, and a lot of and there's been people have been vocal about this issue from all different sides of the political spectrum. So I was just wondering where you stand. You've not been shy to put principles before party politics, so I'd like to know where you stand.
Okay, and yes, please, sir.
Hello, yes. A journalist that I know said that if the Conservatives are unable to fix the housing crisis and allow the young to be able to buy their own homes or flats, then Jeremy Corbyn will be the next Prime Minister. Do you agree?
The question of holding people indefinitely is a really important one. We have to have a functioning system that ensures that people who come to this country can come legally, but we also have to have a system that recognises that some people come as genuine refugees who have suffered serious abuse, and to lock them up seems to me to be wrong, but we've got to know which is which. And do we get the balance right? I think it's very unlikely that we do, that the ability, the success of the Home Office in deporting people who are here illegally is very low. It's not a very well-functioning system. But I think we are a land of liberty. And we believe in liberty for everybody, and we believe in the rule of law for everybody. And that means respecting the rights of all people who are in this country. But we also have to have a system where people who have broken the rules can be safely deported. It is not always easy to get the balance right, and mistakes will be made. But if there's somebody, as you say, who has been raped or who has been tortured or suffered from FGM, then to be holding somebody in that situation in indefinite detention would be deeply troubling. On the question of housing, this is the real challenge for the Conservative Party. And one of the things I think most strongly as a Conservative is that what we're there to do as a party is to deliver as much of what people want as is possible and to take obstacles out of their way. I think, ladies and gentlemen, you make better choices about how to lead your life than I can make for you. I don't believe in the socialist approach that the collective is more important than the individual, and I don't therefore believe that you should be nudged to lead your life in the way that I think is good for you. And when you do opinion surveys, and this goes back to the introduction of the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947, as to what people want, 80% say they wish to live in houses with gardens. And it seems to me that is what the government ought to be delivering. Not tower blocks, not houses with no garden, not incredible dense housing, but housing with gardens. And to do that, as Conservatives, we have to challenge some of our supporters who have been saying we can't build on this space and that space and the next space. Do you know, the interesting thing is, most of our supporters are now ahead of us as politicians. I think the country at large recognises that we need to build hundreds of thousands of houses, and to do so we cannot protect every blade of grass in this country. And we should assume that people want the quality of housing that we all want for ourselves, and that should be made as easy for people to get as possible, but that means lots more building. And we should really look to help people in their ambition to own their own houses, because once people have a stake in society and you have a property-owning democracy, you have a more vibrant and active democracy, and yes, you appeal to younger people. Can I do? You said that Sam upset everybody by wanting people.
No, he upset me. He upset me. They all loved him, but I'm
going to upset you too. Who here wants to own his or her own home at the end of by the time they're 30? Okay.
Trevor, some groans from those over 30s.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Almost all of you put your hands up for that. Now look, what do I think as a politician? What did I say? I should try and take the obstacles out of your path that allow you to lead the lives you want to lead. Therefore, we have a real challenge to build more houses, because if none of you are able to achieve those ambitions, why not have Jeremy Corbyn pinch everybody's money and give it to Caracas? So,
okay, right, so can we have a microphone for the lady with the glasses about 5 or 6 rows back, with the grey top and specs? And then we'll have the chap, the row in front, the ginger-haired chap as well. Yeah, yeah. See, there is an advantage to it. There is an advantage to it. Right, yes, please.
Oh, okay. Hi. So you and some of your colleagues use your Christian faith to justify your stance on certain issues and topics. But when you look at the Gospels and what Jesus taught, there was such an emphasis on looking after the most poor and the most vulnerable and marginalised in society. Yet when you look at your own voting record, some of the arguments you make and rhetoric, and that of some of your colleagues, it seems like you ignore this fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. So I was just wondering what that's about.
And then, yeah.
Thank you. Obviously, Mr. Rees Mogg, you are on the Conservative wing of the Conservative Party. Do you think there is a place for classical liberalism in the Conservative Party?
I might ask them in reverse order, because that is a very easy question to answer, because I'm probably more of a classical liberal than you think. Certainly in terms of economic policy, and I am not on the authoritarian wing of the Conservative Party in terms of law and order, and I believe in our ancient liberties, which I think are of great importance: the protection of trial by jury, the presumption of innocence rather than of guilt, the protection from unreasonable searches by agents of the state, the requirement, I've been very sympathetic to the pro-Europeans on the issue of Henry VIII clauses, because I don't think the executive should have power to tell us all what to do without any say-so of Parliament. So I'm more of a classical liberal than I might want to admit to myself, but certainly than some you may think. To come to the question of Christianity and the teaching of the Gospels, and your basic question, am I a Pharisee? Which I think is a very interesting point. I believe that conservative solutions help the poorest in society most. Okay, let me tell you what I want from Brexit. I want us to take tariffs off food, clothing and footwear. Food, clothing and footwear make up 21% of the average family's budget. But for the poorest in society, that is a higher percentage, inevitably. The average tariff on clothing and footwear is about 11.5% plus 20% VAT. So you're talking about 13.5% to 14% tariffs on clothing and footwear. On food, the tariffs are so high that there's very little import from outside the European Union. If you can make the 21% of people's expenditure, and it's more, as I say, for the poorest in society, 20% lower once you've taken off the tariffs and you've taken away the non-tariff barriers, that is a dramatic improvement in the standard of living in the poorest in society. And frankly, it makes remarkably little difference to the richest in society, who have a much lower expenditure on those essentials. That's why I say conservatism helps the poorest in society. Go back to Margaret Thatcher and the sale of council... Yeah. Thank you. The sale of council houses was transformative in allowing people to become part of a property-owning democracy, to give them a real stake in society. And it allowed people freedom over their own lives. They weren't any longer told by the council what colour they had to paint their front door. And it gave people a stake in their society, it gave their children a stake in society, and it helped get people out of poverty. These things are really transformative, and they are conservative. And I have never thought that you make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. It doesn't work. It's been tried and it fails. Capitalism actually lifts everybody. And if you don't believe me, okay, if you don't believe me, look at the transformation globally as China and India have become capitalist. If you go back to 1980, over 50% of the world was living on under $1 a day. This is now under 20%, and it's almost entirely down to China and India have abandoned socialism. And that has lifted the poorest in the world standard of living. And those of us who are capitalists should be really proud of that, because that is a capitalist success.
I promised I'd read some out, so I'll read two more quick ones for you, and then we'll take some more from the audience. Someone said, since you said you would be honest in your answers, do you honestly believe Theresa May will be Prime Minister by the 31st of March 2019? This one, I think I know how you will answer this one. Did you enjoy Frankie Boyle's description of you as, quote, a composite drawn from the nightmares of 18th century mill workers?
Yes, and I think most of the mill workers were 19th century rather than 18th century, so I would have enjoyed it more if he'd been a little bit more historically accurate.
Right. Okay, we will take I'll take this woman in the front row with the black hair, and then I'll take this woman also in about the third row with the black hair, please. Yeah.
Do you agree with the decision to remove grid girls from the F1 and other sports and things like this?
And please.
So you've been quite vocal in saying that you're critical of Treasury's analysis against Brexit, but I wonder how critical were you of the analysis that was being presented in favour of Brexit leading up to the referendum? For instance, ones that were found to be not exactly accurate, like the savings that could go to the NHS and everything.
Okay, so we got grid girls and that damn bus. Yeah.
I mean, it's a really interesting question, because I believe in a free society where people should be free to do what they want, and that it's therefore, I think, not an area where the state should say yes or no. But as you know, I'm quite old-fashioned. And I believe in treating ladies with respect. And I don't think Grid Girls is treating ladies with respect. I think it is viewing them, it's objectifying them. And frankly, I've never felt comfortable with it. We have in the hall one of the most distinguished political commentators of our time. And I'm quite glad that his newspaper no longer has a naked lady on page 3, because its political commentary was always on page 2. And I always felt rather embarrassed reading page 2 when there was this picture on page 3. So I think it's all about treating people with respect, which I am so strongly in favour of doing. And therefore, perhaps I'm just an old prude, a bit of a stuffed shirt. I'm quite happy that these things are fading out. I don't think they add to society, but I don't want to enforce my will in this area on other people. I think it's for society to decide, for the grid girls to decide, for Formula One to decide. I don't think it's a matter for legislation. On the bus, big six-wheeler, scarlet-painted, 97 horsepower diesel bus, to quote Flanders and Swan, who are always worth quoting. As an aside, I went on safari on honeymoon, and it's amazing my marriage lasted 3 weeks because I kept on singing the Flanders and Swan songs about the various animals we kept on seeing. Anyway, leaving that to one side, in any campaign, people use figures that are available to them to promote their cause. I did not, as it happens, like the £350 million figure, but it wasn't untrue. It was a figure that you came to if you added up our gross contributions annually to the European Union. And therefore, it was of a much less misleading type than the figure produced by the Treasury that I think said we would all lose £4,800, 27p and a farthing if we voted to leave. And the Bank of England, who I thought was particularly disgraceful, I kept on asking the Governor of the Bank of England, why didn't he say, before a general election, the consequences of another party's policies? Never gave a view on that, because it's not for the Bank of England, an independent body, to dip its hands in political controversy. But the Bank of England, as part of the Project Fear, decided to besmirch its own reputation. And that was a sadness, because I admire the Bank of England, or did historically. and many people did. So I don't think the 350 million figure was as bad or as egregious as the figures that came out in the Treasury. And I think the Treasury abused its official status and the money, our money, taxpayers' money, to campaign on one side rather than the other. And I thought that was completely improper. At least the slogan on the side of the bus was paid for by volunteers, by donors. It wasn't taxpayers' money paying for that. The junk that was coming out of the Treasury was paid for by you, ladies and gentlemen.
On that subject, and again, picking up a question that someone's tweeted, so Carney, presumably, you have no confidence in and should be replaced. That's your view. I think you're on record.
I've said that before. I'll say it as many times as you like. Yes.
But you'd say it again if you want.
All right, Carney, delenda est. Yes.
Yeah. You clearly also don't have much faith in the Chancellor, so he should also go.
That is a matter for the Prime Minister. Okay, why?
Let's say it is a matter for the Prime Minister. Who would be your choice to replace the current Chancellor?
I think in these things it is a matter for the Prime Minister. That's the constitutional norm. The Prime Minister has to form Her Majesty's government, but on the advice of the Prime Minister. I have confidence in the Prime Minister, and therefore I think I shouldn't pick and choose this minister and that minister. I've made comments about the Chancellor. I think he's become a semi-detached member of the Cabinet. I think he is freelancing and undermining the constitutional principle of collective responsibility. But just because the Chancellor undermines the Constitution doesn't mean that I should too.
But he's not the only one, is he? I mean, if we're going to be kicking people out for undermining collective responsibility, we're about to have quite a clear out of the Cabinet, it seems to me.
Well, I'm not sure I follow that.
I think you follow it perfectly, but we'll take two more questions. So the chap with the sort of peroxide-y thing on his head, and similar up here again on the left. Yeah, the chap with the yes, you sir. Yeah. Please.
Hello. I think it's very interesting that you're prepared to joke about a lot of these issues when a lot of people right now are dying because of your party's policies. There are a lot of people who are very poor, and you say you care for the poor, but I don't think you can do. Taxes help the poor. What you're doing doesn't, and I don't think even you are that stupid to think that you care for the poor.
And, yes, please.
Hi. When I graduate from my degree at Queen Mary, I will have approximately sort of 50 grand's worth of debt. If I go on to do a master's, which I plan to do, it'll be even more than that. I'm also aware that your son is nearly done with his degree at Oxford, and I may be wrong, but did he have to take a student loan, and how does he plan to pay it off, if so? Do you think it's right that starting out in society, before you even take a job, there is inequality present?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. To come to the first question first, I just think that's wrong. In every sense, that the welfare net in this country is a working one, that it provides a basic level of support for everybody, and that is quite right. That taxation as a percentage of GDP is at the highest level it's been since the early 1970s. There's very little evidence that it would be possible to raise a higher percent of GDP in taxation, and that the top 1% of taxpayers at current rates are paying 27% of the total income tax take. In 1979, when tax rates were at 83% plus an unearned income surcharge that got it up to 98%, the top 1% of taxpayers paid 6% of total income tax. So lower rates, a thriving economy, provides more revenue for the government to provide the public services that people need. And that is economically demonstrable across the world. And I think this slightly hysterical talk about people are dying is belittling the argument. It's just not true. And to come... Thank you for the voice of reason. To come to the gentleman, there's some confusion. though I happen to think all my children are extraordinary geniuses, my eldest son is only 10, so I'm not sure how he's about to complete his degree at Oxford. I think Pitt the Younger went to Cambridge at the age of 11, but that's very exceptional. But I want to answer the serious underlying point. I believe in choice. And I believe that people who make choices should also have responsibility for those choices. And if you have decided to come to university, and may I say a great and successful university that you are at, one of the leading universities in the country, you have made that choice which will lead to you having higher earnings. Out of those earnings, you will pay back the cost of your education. If you don't pay for it, it has to be paid for by somebody else. And you may think it will be paid for by some mythical billionaire. It won't be. National insurance contributions start being paid by people earning about £120 a week. Do you think they should pay for the choice that you're making? VAT is paid by everybody. So what you're really saying is that poorer people than you should pay for your education when you've made the choice and you will get the benefit. I think you've made the choice and you should have the responsibility. But there are great protections. Until you're earning £21,500, you won't pay back. And that's going to rise to £25,000. So that if it turns out that the education on which you've taken out the loan doesn't make you that extra money, then you don't have to pay back and the debt will be written off eventually. So it will depend on your success whether you contribute or not. And I think that's absolutely fair, because therefore you are free to make the choice with a safety net that you won't have this impossible burden in the event that you're not economically successful or that successful. But it means that you can take further choices in your life relatively free of that burden. And I think that's really important and a safeguard. But you know the best thing? That the poorest decile in our society have seen a 73% increase in places at universities since loans were increased. And do you know why that is? It's because the cap on places was removed. When it was all funded by the state retaliated by capping the total number of places. But who were least likely to get the places that were available with a limited pool? Those who had previously been let down by the education system, or whose parents had been let down by the education system. Once the cap was removed, ambitious people from the poorest section of society could suddenly go to university. As a Conservative, I'm really proud of that. I think it's the right policy and a good policy.
Okay, I'm very aware of the time, and I should just say that as soon as we've done this next round of questions, Jacob has to leave. So what we're going to do, let me make this clear. I'll take 2 more questions. I've got one on the pad as well. At the end of those questions, we'd like you to stay seated, please. There will be drinks outside for those of you that want to stay, and you can go and have a glass of god-awful university wine through that door. We will be leaving through that door, and there won't, I'm afraid, be time to do photos and all that sort of modern nonsense that some of you seem to like doing. So I'll take the last 2. I'll take the woman here, yeah, with the white roll-necked top, and I'll take the woman in the sort of black, with your hand couldn't be any straighter if it had a rod through your arm, with the black top there, please. Yes, okay, thank you.
You said you would see yourself as kind of a classical liberal and that people should be free to act as they wish. And so I was wondering what your stance was on the criminalisation or decriminalisation of drugs.
Okay, yes, please.
You've referred a lot to history throughout your talk tonight, and you also mentioned that the voters need to feel like the Tory party can change the world. I just wondered, can the Tory party change the world, or are you a party that promotes stagnation or maybe even regression?
Well, okay, but as those are the last 2 questions, before I answer them, can I thank you very much for having me? It's been really interesting to come. Thank you for all the questions. I was told I would be put through the mill, and I think the questions have lived up to the billing. Thank you. But from my point of view, that makes it much more interesting. So I really appreciate that and the opportunity to discuss these issues. And Phil, thank you so much for inviting me. But to come to the two questions, the legalization of drugs. I think the state should always be very careful about what it makes illegal, but that in the case of drugs, the onus of proof is on the side of those who want to liberalize. What do I mean by that? There has been increasing evidence, particularly with cannabis, that it has serious psychological effects on people. And I think the people who are in favor of legalization need to show that those effects are not there. I've always thought in politics you should have very clear principles, but you have to have a dose of pragmatism as well, and you don't want to take undue risks. So, to take another example, gambling. If we didn't have any gambling laws, I would be very reluctant to introduce gambling laws. If you want to set up a bookmakers, if you want to have a bet amongst yourselves, why should the state interfere? But we've got very strict gambling laws. And the thing I've discovered as a constituency MP is that by and large they're quite successful. And I've had people come to my constituency surgery whose lives have been ruined by gambling. And is it wise of me, however much I believe in liberty, to say that my ideological belief in liberty should risk people absolutely destroying their lives because I made gambling easier? And the same applies to drugs, that ideologically, I see very clearly the argument for legalization. But then I know that it ruins people's lives. So the onus of proof, I think, is on people who want to legalize to say this will not have risks, this will be secure, this will be safe, it will not lead to more deaths or more crime or more lives being ruined. And so, without denying the ideology, I think in day-to-day politics you have to have a layer of pragmatism on top of it. Conservative Party, is it the party of change? Well, I think the role of the Conservative Party is to keep what doesn't need changing and to change what does. And that's easier said than done. But that I don't believe in perpetual revolution. I don't believe in throwing over the tables for the fun of it. But yes, lots of things need changing and improving. And the Conservative Party, when it's at its most successful, is a real engine of change. The brief, I don't know how long I've got, but Disraeli, 1874 to 1881, transformative social legislation on housing, on water, on public health, all about improving the condition of the poorest in society. Harold Macmillan building 300,000 houses a year, and Winston Churchill lifting all the post-war restrictions that still remained. And bear in mind, the socialists wanted to keep rationing going on forever, because they thought it was best determined by the clever people in Whitehall. Douglas Jay said in 1947, the truth is the man in Whitehall really does know best. That is the antithesis of what I believe. The Conservative Party did its best, frees people up, and helps the condition of the poorest in society. Margaret Thatcher, transformative in terms of freeing the economy from detailed regulation, stopping the trade unions, ruining people's lives by the closed shop, by mass picketing, by all the bullying that went with that. And that's our challenge. What should we be doing now that liberates the people and helps them lead the lives they want and encourages that change? And I think it's housing, I think it's taxation, and I think it's lowering the price of food, clothing and footwear once we've left the European Union. And there are really important changes we can make based on our idea. There's one simple idea, ladies and gentlemen. You know better how to lead your life than I know how to lead it for you. And therefore you should be left to lead it for yourself, and I should take obstacles out of your way rather than pretending that nanny knows best. The only nanny who knows best is my nanny in personal circumstances.
That was the sort of answer that will either have them clapping or you shaking your head and you indicate how you want. This is not a question because we're going to wrap up now, but someone, Ewan on social media, did say, can you ask Jacob if he's so pro Wetherspoons, has he used their app? But he follows, he says, if so, I'll be on table 50 at the Half Moon in half an hour.